Okay, so this particular video is a follow-up to the video about the analysis of tariffs. So you've got to be watching that one before you watch this one. And I'm going to look at an evaluation of tariffs by looking at the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs on China. So he put a lot of tariffs on in order to protect American industry, make America great again. And the implication for him was that they were going to reduce the amount of imports coming in from China because America run a big trade deficit, particularly with China. So what this video is going to do is it's going to look at whether or not that actually worked for America. So this is the diagram that we left you with, and I'll get my ugly mug out of the way here. This is the diagram that we left you with when we were looking at the analysis of tariffs, which is that we start off with no tariff and a world price over here. Imports are here between A and B, or Q1 to Q2, and then we put a tariff on, and the idea is that the imports will come down, and if you remember, the analysis of those imports was that the consumer surplus would rise. This area here was an increase in producer surplus, and so you have a fall in consumer surplus, the whole of this area. This area is a rise in producer, so it's simply a transfer of the welfare. This area here is the box of tariff revenue, and so that's simply a transfer, and you're left with two welfare loss triangles. So the first evaluation, if you like, of tariffs is that the consumer welfare loss, the consumer surplus loss, is greater than the tariff and the producer surplus gain, and so there's a welfare loss. But again, go back to that video because it's important that you are able to see what is the impact on the different players, economic players in the market. So consumers, basically that you're arguing that the consumer price went up, real income went down, loss of consumer surplus, etc. But the benefit was on the firms, if you remember, there was this increase in the output of firms, an increase in producer surplus as well. But this video is going to question whether that is actually the case for the whole of the American industrial sector, because it might have been true for the steel industry, which is where these tariffs were placed, but you'll see that there's evidence that it hasn't actually been that successful for other parts of industry. And has it does in this diagram, look, you can see that it has reduced the imports, but the question, which we'll look at later, is, but what about the exports if there is retaliation going on? So this is what this video is going to be look at. So whenever you are going to consider a diagram like so, then really when you start to evaluate, the first thing you can say is the effect on the imports depends on the amount of tariff. In other words, it depends on how much the tariff was. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, he put 20% tariffs on steel. And so I would argue that that was quite significant. But in other case studies you might get, and you might get a case study where they're not using this one, they're using something else, you have to question how much was the tariff. That's always a good starting point, but it's not the best type of evaluation. And you'll often find that the best answers will actually rank their evaluation. So the most important, impact has been this, and the second most important, and the amount by which the tariff has gone on is way down that list really. So the effect also depends, and this would be your second and third evaluation points, I would say, on the PED and the PES. Okay, so I think that is also quite important. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next slide. Okay, so this one here is a certain elasticity of supply, certain elasticity of demand. But when we look at the next slide, here it is. This is the slide which shows you a much more inelastic supply okay, here in the domestic industry, and a much more inelastic demand. And if that's the case, then for any given tariff increase here, you would be arguing that the imports will not go down that much. In other words, when the price of the good has gone up, there has been an extension of output from the domestic industry, but it hasn't been that great. And there has been a cut in demand by the consumers in America, but it hasn't been that great. So, therefore, the more inelastic the supply and the demand are, the less likely it is to reduce the imports. Okay, so that would be one thing to say. And I think what I would always want you to be thinking about doing here is thinking, well, let's take it's the steel industry in America. Did it really create a lot of increase of output? And you've got to understand what is it that lies behind the price elasticity of supply. So if, for example, this was an industry, this is placed on an industry where, for example, you've got a lot of spare capacity in the industry, so the capacity is still there, then the industry could respond quite quickly and easily to the increase in price, and so you'd have a much greater increase in the supply. So those are the sorts of things that you've got to look into, delve behind what affects the elasticity of supply. So the first thing is more inelastic. You're not going to get a big reduction in imports. You're going to get some, but not a big reduction in imports. The second thing, though, and I think this is really important that you get these points, basically, when the tariff is applied to this market here, this might be a raw material which is used in other industries in the country. So when Trump put his tariffs on steel, the price of steel rose, and so that did stimulate an increase in the steel industry. But steel is also used as a raw material in other industries. And we'll see in a minute there's evidence that what would happen there is that the supply curve would shift upwards to the left, causing a reduction in output in those industries and costing jobs in those industries. So the gain in jobs here might be offset by the costing jobs in the other industries that use this particular product, whatever this particular market is, as an input into their industry. And the next thing you need to say about whether the industries are helped is the idea of retaliation. So when Trump put his tariffs on, so did China. China retaliated and they put a tariff on the US exports to China. And so that's going to reduce their exports. So that's going to reduce the exports of other industries, not the steel industry, but other industries in America. And so that's going to cost jobs because there's going to be fewer exports. In addition to that, you need to say, well, even if the imports have gone down, okay, may not have gone down a lot, but they have gone down. If there's retaliation, then exports will also go down. And so really, is there going to be a reduction in the trade deficit that America had with China? And it's hard to say exactly how this works, but I would argue the answer was no, because the trade deficit that America has with China has actually gone up. And I know there's other things that would have affected that, and you can't use the ceteris paribus in the real world in economics, but actually the evidence is that American exporters suffered a lot more. Okay, so we're going to have a look at a couple of these articles that you can find, and I'm going to give you these. I'll zoom in so that you can see. This is one from the Brookings site here, which is a good site to always have a look at. And what this says, if you have a look at this article, so it was, as I say, looking at, starts here, did the tariffs benefit American workers? Okay, and already you can see that what it's saying is that American households have paid several hundred up to $1,000 more because of the higher consumer prices. So that's something that we saw in the analysis video, that real incomes are going to go down. Did they benefit the workers? Well, it depends which workers. Workers who produce the specific goods, in this case steel, tariffs on steel, appear to have been helped. They created several thousand jobs in the steel industry. Tariffs on washing machines, 1,800, etc., etc. So in those industries, the tariff did work out well for the workers. But when you get down to these other jobs, okay, then it basically says here, overall, when economists have attempted to add up the net effect of Trump's tariffs on jobs, any gains in the import competing sectors, that's the steel and the other sectors that we've just referred to, appear to have been more than offset by losses in industry that use imported inputs, that's the first thing, and face retaliation. So those are the two other industries that you need to be thinking about here. And even those jobs that have been created have come at a great cost. Studies are showing that consumers paid $817,000 in higher prices for every job created in the washing machine industry. So the argument here from Brookings is that the policy hasn't really been that successful in terms of the jobs created and in terms of the costs of those jobs as well. Okay. Now the next one is evidence from the Tax Foundation. Okay, so you can just taxfoundation.org. You can search these things out yourself. Firstly, they say tariffs tend to be regressive. In other words, the lower income consumers tend to pay the most with tariffs. Okay, so we talked about that in the analysis video about the socioeconomic groupings. And when they've looked at the evidence, they've said that the tariffs that were imposed by Trump, and they're still in place with the Biden administration, is going to reduce long-run GDP by 0.23% per annum. This is $57 billion a year. Wages are reduced by 0.15 and eliminating 176,000 jobs. Then other countries have announced intentions to impose the tariffs. This is the retaliation that we're talking about, and that could cause GDP to fall even more. So their basic conclusion is free trade increases the level of economic output and income. That's what we generally agree. But conversely, trade barriers reduce economic output and income. Historical evidence shows that tariffs raise prices, reduce quantities of goods and services for US businesses and consumers, lower income, lower employment, and lower economic output. So this final paragraph there is a good summary of what the, let's say, the Tax Institute has actually concluded. And the last one, piece of evidence, this one comes from this Pearson site. Now, this is a really good site, so I'm just going to zoom in. So if you want to find it, you basically type in Sloman Economics News, and if you type that in, then you'll come up with a link to this site, which is linked to the Sloman economics textbook, which is used at university level, but all very good for A-level students to be looking at this. Okay, and this is what I wanted to point out. Assuming there's no retaliation from other countries, jobs would be gained in the steel and aluminium industry. According to a report by the Trade Partnership, the tariffs would increase employment in these industries by 33,000 new jobs. However, the higher price of these metals caused job losses in the industries using them. And this is such an easy quote and a really good context. According to this report, more than 5 jobs are lost for every one gained. Okay, so it's a really important evaluation of job creation that is meant to come through the tariffs. And then it says here, finally, just to sum it all up, The costs are much greater than this. According to the law of comparative advantage, trade is a positive sum gain. In other words, both countries benefit from comparative advantage. Unless trade restrictions are used to address a specific market distortion, so you can use that according to the World Trade Organization if the other country are unfairly subsidizing their industries. But unless it's used for that, restricting trade will lead to a net loss in overall benefits to the parties involved. Clearly, there's a loss to steel and aluminium exporters outside the US, that's the Chinese, but there will also be a net loss to their countries unless these metals had a higher cost of production in the US but were subsidized by government. So, this argument that there's for every job gained, there is 5 lost following the tariffs is quite an interesting evaluation. So hopefully that gives you some really good context. These are articles that you can find yourself quite easily, and it gives you a good evaluation of whether or not tariffs are a successful instrument and the implications of putting tariffs on for a whole country.